Kevin Johnson will be put to death today despite one last effort by his legal team.
Kevin Johnson has sat on death row for killing Sergeant William McEntee.
I think that was like the hardest part to cope with, being a protected person and not being able to do anything.
Whether there's any reason that the lawful execution of Kevin Johnson for the murder of William McEntee should not proceed.
Kevin Johnson will be put to death by the state of Missouri November 29th.
All the slanders and comments and judgments and unfounded and simply not true.
Accusations claiming a former St. Louis County prosecutor sought the death penalty specifically for black defendants, but not white defendants.
He's been more supportive in my life than most of my friends' fathers.
The case of Kevin Johnson was found to be tainted by racism by a special prosecutor. In any case, Missouri is about to slay him. Facing the impending execution, a daughter's journey. Corey Ramey didn't talk to her father growing up about the day he would be ended. She remarked, "It was too uncomfortable for me." In 2007, when she was just 4 years old, her father, Kevin Johnson, was transferred to Missouri's Ending Row. She used to visit him when he was a kid at the Potosi Correctional Facility, which is about an hour and a half from St. Louis. Together, they played Scrabble and snapped Polaroid pictures that could be bought for $1 each. There wasn't anything to say about Johnson's offense that Ramey didn't already know. When he was 19 years old, he slayed a police officer, and everyone in the area knew this. Though difficult, it wasn't a secret, as she put it. Most significantly, she still saw Johnson as she did before. As Ramey got older, they discussed the typical topics parents talk to their children about: school, family, and his expectations for her future. Johnson contacted Ramey on January 1st, 2022.
Good morning. There is a last-minute effort to halt this execution.
What is happening today at the Missouri Supreme Court is pretty unusual. It's actually unprecedented in Missouri.
When she was 18, sounding different, she remarked, implying that he might not be around for long. He was kind of like throwing hints at me. She felt uneasy during the chat. It was obvious that he was attempting to get her ready for the ending date. Ramey learned she was pregnant later that evening. Ramey had graduated early from high school with his support and was pursuing a career as a nurse. So she was afraid about upsetting her father. She had worn a t-shirt with a picture of her father, together with her maternal grandmother and mother, who had been slayed in front of Ramey just months before Johnson was found guilty.
Whether there's any reason that the lawful execution of Kevin Johnson for the murder of William McEntee should not proceed.
People who I can get in contact with to help me further my career in the nursing field that I want to do.
Underneath her crimson graduation gown, on the t-shirt it said, "I did it for y'all." Ramey received a call from her aunt in the latter part of August. She informed Ramey that her father had been given a date for his ending and forewarned her that the news would be all over it. A little while afterwards, Johnson called. He told her, "They came and got me and told me to pack all my stuff." His beheading was scheduled for November 29th.
As Kevin came to the realization that a fractured faith is better than no faith at all.
Kevin Johnson has sat on death row for killing Sergeant William McEntee.
After just 2 weeks, Ramey gave birth. She shared infant photos of herself, her father, and her son, Caius, on Facebook. She took him to visit Johnson in October, allowing him to touch his grandchild for the first time. Ramey remarked, "That was a very beautiful event." Early in November, Ramey called The Intercept from the nursing home where she works between shifts. She hadn't even told her employer about her father's impending ending, much less taken time off to deal with it.
Kevin Johnson will be put to death today despite one last effort by his legal team.
The man on death row convicted of shooting and killing a Kirkwood police officer.
She was still working out a number of logistical issues, including this one. One more was even more intimidating. She was too young, 19 years old, under Missouri law to witness the ending. She wasn't sure of her whereabouts when the state slayed Johnson. Being there at the prison seemed significant. Ramey asserted that even if her father couldn't see her, he would at least know that I'm there with him in his final moments, and he wasn't alone.
Governor Mike Parson said today he will not grant clemency in this case.
That's right. Today at 6 p.m., Kevin Johnson will be put to death by lethal injection at the state prison in Bonne Terre.
Ramey felt it wasn't enough as Johnson's ending date drew near. The American Civil Liberties Union submitted an emergency lawsuit on November 21st, requesting intervention and granting her permission to witness the ending. She declared before the court, "My father has been the only parent for almost all my life. He holds a special place in my heart. I would sit at his bedside if my father were in the hospital dying, holding his hands and praying for him till he passed away as a comfort for both of us, as an essential step in my grief process." There are still a lot of legal challenges ongoing in the courts.
I think that was like the hardest part to cope with, being a protected person and not being able to do anything.
Advocates, including Missouri's NAACP, say he should not be executed.
Despite Johnson's ending being just days away, the most crucial issue is whether Johnson's conviction was unconstitutionally contaminated by widespread racism. As assessed by a special prosecutor appointed to review the case, the prosecutor is currently attempting to get Johnson's ending sentence overturned. St. Louis County has gained notoriety for institutional racism in the 17 years since Johnson was given an ending sentence, with its policing and legal procedures being the most egregious examples. The dynamics in Johnson's case and how the ending penalty has been used to uphold the status quo are exemplary.
State of Missouri, you have to be at least 21 years old to witness an execution.
Past doesn't define you. You can do something horrific in your past, but you could be a better person today.
Sean Nolan, the special prosecutor's attorney, believes that the finding requires stopping Johnson's ending. Nolan added, "But the state of Missouri is about to execute people based on the color of their skin. Civilized countries don't do that." The crime. On July 5th, 2005, Kevin Johnson, then 19 years old, was visiting his great-grandmother when two police officers entered the house and began looking through his white Ford Explorer. Johnson was under probation because of a domestic disagreement involving the mother of his little daughter, Corey, who was his ex-girlfriend. The police wanted to arrest him and maybe tow his vehicle because he had broken the terms of his probation.
Again, a 19-year-old kid who made a horrible mistake, but he definitely is remorseful and he deserves to live.
So he does way more than what most people would feel like they would be able to do behind.
The Missouri Supreme Court has overruled a motion to stop his execution.
Johnson had a plan to prevent that from happening. Joseph Long, his younger brother, whom everyone called Bam Bam, received the keys to his car from him. In Meacham Park, a rich, largely white Kirkwood, Missouri suburb that stretches west of St. Louis, Johnson and his siblings had grown up in challenging circumstances. Kirkwood is one of the many suburbs that sprawl there. Johnson's father spent the majority of his life in prison, while his mother had a crack addiction. Johnson and his siblings had endured cruelty and neglect, at times being abandoned for days at a time. Johnson took very special care of 12-year-old Bam Bam, who had been exposed to cocaine while still in the womb and was born with a congenital cardiac condition that required immediate surgery.
Johnson's daughter says she wants to be there.
All the slanders and comments and judgments and unfounded and simply not true.
In order to make it appear as though his grandma Pat Ward owned the Explorer, Johnson ordered Bam Bam to take the car keys to her house next door. Bam Bam stood up and ran to the next house. Johnson saw from the window, and what he saw started a series of events that he would always regret. Johnson reported that Ward left the house holding the keys and yelling for the police to arrive immediately because Bam Bam had collapsed. When the police showed up at Ward's front door,
their family members should be able to be there in those final moments.
Rami should get a decision by this weekend.
Johnson was unable to see Bam Bam but observed one of them step over something as he entered. As an ambulance and a third officer, Kirkwood Police Sergeant William McKenty, approached, sirens blasted. Despite his family's warning to stay home or risk being arrested, Johnson was tempted to run next door and aid. Jada Tatum, Johnson's mother, arrived and was pushed back by McKenty, according to Johnson, who nearly knocked her off the porch. Johnson later admitted in court,
"He was a wonderful child. I'm sure he's a wonderful child."
Also, Sergeant McEntee leaves behind 3 children and is a 20-year veteran once again.
"It looked to me like they were fighting, and I started to get angry. After a while, his mother simply stopped and went outside to begin sobbing." Johnson witnessed the emergency personnel departing with Bam Bam on a stretcher over 20 minutes after the ambulance had arrived. His feet were hanging over the side, and his shirt was gone. Soon afterward,
Johnson's daughter and several anti-death penalty activists are also calling for Johnson's death sentence to be overturned today.
Kevin Johnson will be put to death by the state of Missouri November 29th.
Ward came back and told him that Bam Bam had left. Later, an autopsy confirmed that he had passed away from a heart failure. Johnson claimed that at first, he was too surprised to respond. Then, in a fit of rage, he kicked his bedroom door's hinges off. He reflected that perhaps this wouldn't have happened if he hadn't asked Bam Bam to take the keys. Why had Ward requested the police for assistance, and they had responded so casually?
Because I have a son who needs his papa, and I'm a daughter who needs her dad.
As Johnson was convicted 15 years ago of killing that veteran officer.
Perhaps Bam Bam would still be alive if he had been taken to the hospital sooner. Johnson went outside in an effort to relax. He took a revolver out of the trunk of his car and put it in his pocket since, as he subsequently admitted. It may get him into even more trouble if the police return to tow the car. People questioned Johnson about whether Bam Bam had indeed passed away.
Johnson's first trial was declared a mistrial. The second ended with first-degree murder conviction.
Justice for Kevin Johnson!
Justice for Kevin! As he walked around the tightly knit Mitcham Park, he admitted to his cousin that he believed the police were to blame. Nearly 7:30 p.m., returning to Mitcham Park in response to a call concerning firework being set off, McKenty was there. An expended firecracker was being carried by one of the three teenagers when he pulled his cruiser alongside them. Johnson walked by on the passenger side while he spoke to them via the driver's side window. McKenty looked at him, and the officer grinned. Johnson drew his weapon. Witnesses remembered him yelling, "You slayed my brother."
Now, Johnson is scheduled to die by lethal injection tomorrow night in Bonne Terre.
He's been more supportive in my life than most of my friends' fathers.
As he fired at the automobile, hitting McKenty several times. One of the shots entered McKenty's jaw after going through his cheek. McKenty was able to start the automobile despite being severely hurt, and it jerked up the street before colliding with a tree. Residents nearby were yelling. When Johnson ran into his mother, she inquired about his actions. He told her Bam Bam was slayed by the police. She answered, "No, Bam Bam just died." She broke down in tears.
His children were devastated that their dad was murdered, being 7, 10, and 13.
You know, it's moving and stuff, but 3 years, you don't know any better. You just know you're hungry and stuff.
Pleading with him to think about his daughter, Corey. Johnson recalls leaving to rush to meet Corey. By squeezing between two homes, he was able to return to McKenty's wrecked car. On the sidewalk, the bloodied officer was kneeling as Johnson approached McKenty from behind and shot him in the head. Onlookers dispersed. Shortly after, McKenty was declared deceased. Johnson sped away in his Explorer past a line of responding police vehicles. He later said that it was only then that he realized what he had done.
Accusations claiming a former St. Louis County prosecutor sought the death penalty specifically for black defendants, but not white defendants.
We got separated maybe early 90s from each other.
3 days later, when he surrendered himself, Johnson only asked that Corey, his toddler, be allowed to see him by the police. They declined.
To be executed in less than 24 hours now for the shooting death of Sergeant William McEntee 17 years ago.
Notify the Department of Corrections that there are no legal impediments to the lawful execution of Kevin Johnson.
Past doesn't define you. You can do something horrific in your past, but you could be a better person today.
The trails. The slay of McEntee made St. Louis front page. Police told the media it had been more than 100 years since a police officer has been slayed in Kirkwood. The father of three, 43, had been a Kirkwood police officer since the 1980s. Police scattered balloons and flowers on the grass in front of the police station. Robert McCulloch, the prosecuting attorney in St. Louis, stated that he was thinking about asking for Johnson's ending. McCulloch had built a reputation for obtaining ending sentences throughout his 17 years in office and had a particular interest in punishing officer slayers. Paul McCulloch was one of the best-known officers in the St. Louis police force, according to a 1964 news item that praised him as a renowned canine trainer whose dog had a talent for sniffing out drugs. McCulloch was just 12 years old when his own father was slain in the line of duty. For the slay of McCulloch, a black man called Eddie Glenn was found guilty and given the ending penalty. The sentence was changed to life in prison after the ending penalty was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1972.
And was on his hands and knees in his own pool of blood when Kevin Johnson shot him 2 more times.
Johnson could be put to death as soon as 6 p.m. tonight in Bonne Terre.
The state and the Children's Division of the Family Court probably let Kevin down and didn't provide the services they needed.
As Kevin came to the realization that a fractured faith is better than no faith at all. And I believe that that's what's getting him.
Many residents of Meacham Park believe that the real circumstances of Mackenzie's slaying were not being covered, despite the headlines trumpeting a potential ending sentence against Johnson. Family members claim that Johnson had been upset by Bam Bam's passing, in part because police had been prioritized his arrest over aiding his brother, according to a black writer for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Following the columnist's discussion of Bam Bam's burial arrangements, readers wrote in to complain that the author had slandered a fallen officer and excused the slayer. Johnson was put on trial twice, the first time in March 2007. Both sides' families were present in the courtroom, along with numerous police officers. McCulloch acknowledged Bam Bam's death as the cause of Mackenzie's slay in his opening remarks to the jury. However, he denied the allegations that Mackenzie abused Tatum, Bam Bam's mother, or that police failed to act promptly to save the child. Tatum urged Mackenzie to sit with her on the porch as they were attempting life-saving measures when he arrived, according to testimony from an EMT. Most significantly, McCulloch disagreed with the idea that Johnson had behaved rashly and without thought.
The emotionally charged moment of his life. He was watching his little brother Bam Bam die, for God's sake.
Bob McCullough's office has only sought the death penalty for black defendants in police death cases.
Like I said, if I can erase that day, I would.
The evidence was clear that there was racial discrimination infecting this prosecution.
Johnson's allegation that he was on his way to see his daughter when he ran into Mackenzie again was refuted by the man, who contended that Johnson had taken a gun from his car with the clear to intent to slay a police officer. McCulloch claimed that Johnson had returned to the scene after learning that Mackenzie was still alive and had brutally carried out the slay. He told the jurors, "Each one of those shots, in and of itself, is deliberate." Graphic testimony was given. One Kirkwood police officer found it difficult to speak as he remembered crouching down to roll Mackenzie over, only to see bits of his head fall over his lap. Mackenzie's co-workers vividly detailed the horror. Johnson's cousin claimed that he puked after seeing Mackenzie get slayed, leading Johnson to brand him a coward. McCulloch painted Johnson as a danger who would slay again if given a chance, despite the fact that the majority of the witnesses who knew Johnson claimed during cross-examination that they had never had issues with him before. In addition to the cold-blooded slay of Mackenzie, Johnson allegedly reportedly attempted to assassinate potential witnesses who could testify against him. The case of Sergeant Mackenzie, a man who was shot and slayed by his brother, was a complex and contentious one. The defense, led by McCulloch, claimed that Johnson had threatened the jury and that he had discussed an extensive plan to have important witnesses assassinated by a jailhouse informant with a lengthy criminal history. However, some witnesses appeared hesitant to accuse Johnson, and some provided police statements only to retract them when forced to testify. The jury found this argument strong, and when it came time to decide Johnson's fate, the jury overwhelmingly ruled the first-degree slay was not the cause of death. The deliberations were acrimonious, with some black jurors yelling things about their neighborhoods and "you people."
Tonight, they remain hopeful that a stay of execution could be made in Johnson's case.
Children were devastated that their dad was murdered, being 7, 10, and 13.
Kevin Johnson will be put to death by the state of Missouri November 29th.
12 men and women that sat on Kevin Johnson's jury were fair. They were qualified to hear the case, and they were not biased.
Another black juror claimed that the trial judge had summoned her to meet with her after a white lady on the jury accused another of acting in an intimidating manner. The jury claimed that despite claims of intimidation, the overwhelming police presence was what gave her the most anxiety. A new trial was held in 2007 when a jury consisting of 9 white and 3 black members. Other adjustments were made. such as substituting a video of the crime for the jailhouse informant's account of a plans to slay witnesses. McCulloch also underlined that McEntee had not abused Johnson's mother and supported testimony about the cops' efforts to save Bam Bam. One of the officers who arrived on the scene was questioned by McCulloch, who said that he just tried to get her to go outside and he was kind of holding on to her, trying to hold her up. She had a great deal of grief for her son. St. Louis County Medical Examiner Mary Case testified as McCulloch's last witness at the retrial, outlining the injuries each gunshot caused to McEntee. She displayed a model skeleton where the bullets had entered his body, pointing out that while McEntee might have survived some of the most severe wounds, being shot in the head was impossible to survive. Upon verdict, Johnson was found guilty of first-degree slay on November 8, 2007.
It does not benefit this state. It does not benefit our society to kill Kevin Johnson.
Convicted of killing a Kirkwood police officer in 2005.
Johnson's attorneys argue race played a factor in the death penalty sentencing.
It's hard because I know that if it does happen, he's not going to be here.
The Missouri Supreme Court has overruled a motion to stop his execution, meaning it will go on as planned tomorrow.
The three siblings of McEntee gave testimony about the void his passing had caused in their family. Johnson's defense attorneys painted him an unloved youngster who had never lived in a secure environment. He claimed that because of his terrible upbringing, he shouldn't face just punishment and doesn't deserve it. McCulloch claimed that Johnson's failure to take advantage of his opportunity was the true issue. Defense counsel Karen Kraft argued that there was more to the case than what the jury had seen before they decided to sentence her client to demise. A witness for the defense said that McEntee repeatedly pulled her over while she was living in Meacham Park. Kraft claimed that she deliberated long and hard before deciding to summon this witness, as she didn't like speaking ill of the dead. Meacham Park. Johnson had been awaiting ending for 7 years when, following another homicide in St. Louis County, McCulloch's name suddenly appeared on the national scene. Unarmed black teenager Michael Brown was slayed in 2014 by a white police officer called Darren Wilson. As a result of the slaying in Ferguson, the Black Lives Matter movement gained momentum and incorporated the slogan, "Hands up, don't shoot," to its vocabulary. Wilson's case would become a symbol of systemic racism and the lack of consequences for violent police officers because of McCulloch's handling of the prosecution.
Despite these last efforts from family, friends, and otherwise, Johnson is scheduled to die by lethal injection.
If my brother was executed, it's gonna break me all the way down.
Again, a 19-year-old kid who made a horrible mistake, but he definitely is remorseful and he deserves to live.
Authorities have said that Johnson was angry, believing police did not do enough to save his younger brother.
By blaming the media for the demonstrations and saying that the grand jurors, who were primarily white, gave up their lives to see the investigation through to its conclusion, McCulloch added gasoline to the fire when he revealed that a grand jury had failed to indict Wilson. Long, simmering conflicts over how St. Louis County's black people are treated by law enforcement were made public by the Ferguson protests. Although the Department of Justice ultimately decided not to bring charges against Wilson, it did find that Ferguson police had routinely violated the constitutional rights of black residents, illegally detaining and arresting them as part of a plan that put the collection of fines and fees ahead of the responsibility to maintain public safety. In addition to not being diverse, the department did not interact with the community, disregarded reports of police misconduct, and engaged in actions that promoted distrust and resentment. Such police misconduct, along with the complaints it inspired, was not limited to Ferguson. Johnson's situation can only be completely appreciated in the context of the community's relationship with police. According to lifestyle residents of St. Louis County like Michelle Smith, co-director of Missourians for Alternatives to the Ending Penalty, Smith remarked, "There was a Meacham Park before there was a Ferguson." Meacham Park was founded in 1892 as an unincorporated black community about 14 miles west of St. Louis, surrounded at the time by farmland and forests. The sand streets bear the names of notable figures and locations from black history. Meacham Park was booming at the beginning of the 20th century, despite lacking running water and sewage.
The last minute, just 24 hours before Johnson is set to be executed by lethal injection.
What is happening today at the Missouri Supreme Court is pretty unusual. It's actually unprecedented in Missouri.
Outside the court, there was a demonstration against the planned execution, more protests.
At 7:31 p.m., the 5-minute timer was set. At 7:40 p.m., Kevin Johnson was pronounced dead.
However, as suburban construction grew, Meacham Park became vulnerable due to lax state legislation limiting the creation of new municipalities, which led to a drawn-out dispute over Kirkwood's annexation by rich, white Kirkwood. Creating municipal boundaries was a method of segregation, according to Colin Gordon, a history professor at the University of Iowa who has written about race and inequality in St. Louis County. As a result, some people are subjected to officially surveillance while others receive public assistance, according to Gordon. Kirkwood undertook its first land grab in the late 1950s when it annexed a lucrative commercial area of Meacham Park with no compensation to the neighborhood. When Interstate 44 cut through the area in 1956, it paved over homes and left a portion of the neighborhood stranded. Kirkwood authorities were wringing their hands in the background because they didn't want to be responsible for Meacham Park's service delivery. But they also didn't want the neighborhood's alleged issues to spread to Kirkwood. Mosquitoes bred in the failing septic tanks in the Meacham Park, or potential criminals raised in an environment devoid of police protection, are not respecters of municipal boundary lines, city leaders wrote in a proposed response plan in 1966. The Meacham Park homeowners finally consented to an annexation plan in 1991. It was promised that jobs for locals would be created through commercial development along a specific stretch of the area's western perimeter. The development's footprint grew, absorbing 100 homes and forcing neighbors to relocate for what ultimately became a wall of big box business that further cut off Meacham Park from the rest of Kirkwood.
Losing a child, my heart can't take no more. It cannot take anymore.
They didn't have a chance to say goodbye. It took 17 years of grieving and pushing forward.
Former St. Louis County prosecutor used racial bias in several cases, including Johnson.
Childhood friend of Johnson's, Damian Pullum, claimed in his affidavit that police once maced a group of youths for loitering in the church parking lot during a high school football game and hassled Johnson's grandmother's spouse for polishing his car in the driveway. In several of the affidavits, McKenty was particularly mentioned as aiding in the harassment. Pullum claimed that McKenty earned the nickname Tackleberry because he was big and he would tackle and beat people up. Students recounted anecdotes about Mac to the Riverfront Times. According to Ramona Miller, a science teacher at Kirkwood High School in 2005, one of the stories they gave was about how Mac escalated one incident to the point where another officer had to step in. I had never heard the kids talk specifically about a person, so that was concerning to me, Miller said to The Weekly. She claimed that despite contacting the Kirkwood police with her worries, she never got a response. I often wondered if we could have avoided a lot of this if that had been taken more seriously.
Last-minute efforts to stop an execution. The man on death row convicted of shooting and killing a Kirkwood police officer.
Sergeant William McEntee was ambushed and shot 5 times in his police car. He crashed his car.
For more than a decade, Kevin Johnson has sat on death row for killing Sergeant William McEntee.
The chief had no memory of Miller's complaint, a KPD representative said to the St. Louis Beacon. He's not denying it, the spokeswoman insisted. We received several complaints. Smith emphasized that the allegations against McEntee were not intended to condone slaying. We wish McEntee was still in attendance. She was direct about the part he and the other officers played in Meacham Park though. He was a terrorist in that neighborhood, which is the reality of the situation.
I didn't have anything, no money, no real place to live.
And Kevin Johnson decided to be judge, jury, and executioner. When he walked back to Bill's car.
I remember when I had a contact visit in the county jail.
For her PhD research, sociology and African studies professor Andrea Boyles of Tulane University spoke with residents of Meacham Park about their interactions with police. Later, that project was published as the book Race, Place, and Suburban Policing. Boyles noted that Meacham Park and Kirkwood had a long-standing racial dispute, and that, ultimately, there were a number of things that transpired in the annexation process, including full loss of land and people losing their homes or being bought out, feeling like they had been manipulated. Perhaps the most obvious sign of their dissatisfaction was their mistrust of the police. They told me about the entire process, including the city council, not just the police, she continued. And they already felt like, in many respects, that they had been indifferently characterized as baggage or weight or throwaways that needed to be saved by the neighborhood rich white people. She was told by locals that after violent episodes like the Slay of Mackenzie, they felt as though the entire neighborhood was being blamed for what occurred. The racial, spatial, and political climate of that place made it ripe for people to lose in different ways. According to Boyles, and without justifying or condemning it, the outcome would be the loss of countless lives and the potential threat we currently face from another. A cloud over the case. Voters removed Wesley Bell, the incumbent St. Louis County prosecutor, following Ferguson ending his almost 30-year tenure in office. In order to evaluate officer-involved slayings, claims of police misconduct, and claims of unfair prosecution or conviction, Bell established a conviction and incident evaluate unit in 2019. This signaled a change from McCulloch's previous practices. In order to address the issue of false convictions within the criminal justice system, Missouri legislators established a statute in 2021. According to the law, the prosecutors who initially brought the case against the defendant may make a move to overturn the judgment there. If constitutional error at the original trial undermines the confidence in the judgment, the trial court must hold an inquiry.
Missouri Supreme Court obviously takes these matters very seriously. They have granted oral argument.
But that final decision will be up to the Missouri Supreme Court.
I've been doing this work for a long, long time, and I've never had a case where the prosecutor asked to stop the execution.
Johnson's attorneys requested that the prosecution examine his convictions in December 2021 on the grounds that racial bias rendered it inadmissible under the Constitution. However, there was a conflict of interest right away because Steele, one of Johnson's trial defense attorneys, now works for Bell. Bell's office informed the Missouri Supreme Court in a letter dated July that it was evaluating Johnson's case and seeking a special prosecutor to lead the investigation. The request was ignored by the court, which scheduled Johnson's ending for November. Edward Keenan, a lawyer in Kansas City, was chosen by the St. Louis County Circuit Court to serve as the special prosecutor in October. Keenan analyzed more than 31,000 pages of case-related paperwork before submitting a request to the trial court, asking for Johnson's conviction to be overturned.
This is a case where it's the prosecutor asking to stop the execution.
That all petitions have been denied by the U.S. Supreme Court, and the department could begin with the execution sequence.
Which they don't do very often in these situations.
He cited a note that he discovered in the files of the prosecution, which revealed that McCulloch's group had planned to exclude black jurors from Johnson's second trial. It is also instructive to look at McCulloch's past history of charging decisions, which are made at the sole discretion of the prosecutor. Throughout his tenure, McCulloch was much more likely to ask for the ending penalty when the victim was a white person. According to a recent study by political science professor Frank Baumgartner at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, even after accounting for several factors, McCulloch's office was 3.5 times more likely to request the ending penalty when the victim was white. Emails from The Intercept requesting comment from McCulloch received no response. McCulloch recently refuted accusations of racially motivated convictions in an interview with the Riverfront Times, defending his track record in the process. The attorneys of Keenan and Johnson both filed an appeal of the decision with the Missouri Supreme Court, requesting that it stay the ending so that the lower court may hear the evidence. According to Johnson's attorneys, this court should consider the special prosecutor's motion to vacate for what is the state's confession of error, which has not been refuted. The state admits long-standing and pervasive racial bias in St. Louis County's handling of this case.
Missouri Attorney General Eric Schmidt notified the Department of Corrections that there are no legal impediments to the lawful execution of Kevin Johnson.
And so I had some communication with other people here and told them, like, this is what you need to do. You need to communicate with her as much as possible.
Yeah, he always tells me to do my best.
And other death-eligible prosecutions, including the office decision with regard to which offense to charge, which penalty to seek, and which jurors to strike. The day before Johnson is scheduled to pass away on November 28th, the Missouri Supreme Court will hear oral arguments. Witnessing death. Representative Cori Bush of St. Louis and Representative Emmanuel Cleaver of Kansas City both issued letters 2 days before Thanksgiving. They pleaded with Missouri Governor Mike Parson to pardon Johnson. They stated, Johnson's brutal ending will not cure any of the systemic problems plaguing Missourians and people across America, particularly the scourge of gun violence. It will cynically use the ideas of justice and fairness as a cover to simply ruin yet another family and community. Johnson's mercy petition, which stressed his youth at the time of the crime, was a source of inspiration for the letter. The U.S. Supreme Court prohibited the ending of juvenile offenders who committed capital offenses in 2005, the same year Johnson slayed McKenty. Scientific studies showing how much the human brain develops during the adolescence served as a foundation for the Roper v. Simmons decision. It is now generally known that the areas of the brain responsible for impulse control are still developing well into early adulthood, and the conditions like poverty, abuse, and neglect have a significant impact on this process. The American Psychological Association came to the conclusion earlier this year that Johnson's age in 2005, which is between 18 and 20, should be included in the Roper prohibitions. Parson informed reporters on November 23rd that he did not intend to step in, despite the fact that he has not yet made an official declaration about clemency.
Governor Parsons' office was asked whether there's any reason that the lawful execution of Kevin Johnson.
Now attorneys and advocates are looking to Missouri's governor and the state Supreme Court to spare his life.
For the murder of William McEntee should not proceed. The answer was to proceed.
Today, Johnson's history in prison serves as a proof of how young individuals develop beyond their sins. According to his mercy petition, which included numerous letters from guys who were detained and praised him as a mentor and role model, he is regarded as a model inmate at Potosi, a group of educators who have maintained since Johnson's trial that he was a good kid who did a sad act of violence on one of the worst days of his life are among his most vociferous defenders. Johnson's primary school principal, Pam Stanfield, who has gotten to know him very well over the years, said of him that he is a loving father whose relationship with Ramsey far exceeds what many fathers are able to do while living outside prison walls.
He's been more supportive in my life than most of my friends' fathers.
I think that was like the hardest part to cope with, being a protected person and not being able to do anything.
That are out in the regular world, living and have their freedom.
Stanfield highlighted over the phone that Johnson had expressed profound regret for slaying McKenty. If he could go back and change something, he would give anything, she claimed. But he is so much more than that too. The day after Thanksgiving, Ramey's legal team held a press conference to announce her battle to see her father put to demise. Ramey intended to make a statement, but found it difficult to do so. The remainder of her writing was read aloud by Smith of Missourians for alternatives to the ending penalty. In the statement, Ramey mentioned how she had witnessed the slaying of her mother when she was 4 years old, saying, "I have suffered so much loss in my life. The thought that she would not be around to witness her lone surviving parent's final moments was agonizing. It makes no sense that under Missouri law, an adult who is 19 is not mature enough to be present at the person's ending if the state of Missouri thinks that my father's action at the age of 19 make him mature enough to be executed."
We're asking the court to find that this irrational and illogical law discriminates against Cori.
However, in a recent interview, Parsons said that the execution for Kevin Johnson will continue.
Missouri shouldn't use it as an excuse to keep her from bearing witness for her father when he is taken away from her.
Later that evening, a federal judge dismissed Ramey's legal objection. In his opinion, Missouri had a legitimate reason to want to keep kids from witnessing death. He mentioned Roper in 2005 as an example of a significant Supreme Court decision that limited the use of life sentences for juveniles. In his letter, he expressed concern that young people may be more inclined to act out in ways that are disruptive, endangering the solemnity and decorum of the ending. The lawyer defending Johnson, Nolan stated, "We are heartbroken for Corey. This case is tragic in every way, but we assure Corey that we will continue to fight for her father." On November 29th at 7:40 p.m., Kevin Johnson received a fatal injection to end his life. He declined to offer a parting remark. Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Ketanji Brown Jackson of the U.S. Supreme Court disagreed with the full court's decision to deny a stay of ending. Sean Nolan, Johnson's attorney, issued the following statement: "Without a doubt, Kevin was executed by Missouri because he was black after being put on death row and prosecuted in a capital case. The governor and the Missouri Supreme Court put an end to the special prosecutor's pursuit of racial justice, and Kevin was executed despite the fact that the current prosecutor appointed by the court found that Kevin's ending sentence was the result of blatant racism by St. Louis County District Attorney's Office. People should be held accountable by the law for their actions, not for who they are. However, Kevin was slain in Missouri due to the hue of his skin. Shame on them all." And that's all for this video, folks. See you next time.